So my name is Denis Didier Rousseau. I am the Fall Meeting Program Chair, and this is my great pleasure to introduce you this year Union Frontiers and Geophysics speaker, Professor Jeff Sax. Jeff Sax is a world-renowned professor of economics, leader in sustainable development, senior UN advisor, best-selling author, and a syndicated columnist whose monthly newspaper columns appear in more than 80 countries. Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Earth Institute, Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development, and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. Quoting his Wikipedia page, it's easy to do so. In his capacity as director of the Earth Institute, he leads a university-wide organization of more than 850 professionals from natural sciences and social science disciplines in support of sustainable development. Jeff Sax has consistently advocated for the expansion of university education on sustainable development and helped to introduce a PhD in sustainable development at Columbia University, one of the first PhD programs of its kind in the US. He championed the new Master of Development Practice, MDP, which has led to a consortium of major universities around the world offering the new degree. The Earth Institute has also guided the adoption of sustainable development as a new major at Columbia College. The Earth Institute is home of cutting-edge research on all aspects of Earth systems and sustainable development, and among them, Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. Professor Sachs is a special advisor to United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Millennium Development Goals, having held the same position under former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan. He is director of the UN Sustainable Development Solution Networks. He is co-founder and chief strategist of Millennium Promise Alliance, and is director of the Millennium Village Project. Professor Sachs has authored numerous papers related to diverse fields, just citing from the Web of Science. Let me put my glasses. Biodiversity conservation and the Millennium Development Goals, improving the health of the global poor, and environment investments towards sustainable development. These are among the 10 top-cited papers I got from the Web of Science. Finally, Professor Sachs authored 3 New York Times bestsellers in the past 7 years. The End of Poverty, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. Very interesting books. Any known economist will be interested by the thesis defended by Professor Sachs in his books, which give light on how the economic situation evolved toward what we are facing presently, and the questions the solutions apply. Moreover, his latest book has nothing to do with economy, earth sciences, even if the title, To Move the World, could correspond to our planet momentum. For me, this is a fascinating book that I recommend you to read. I have no interest in that, but I recommend you to read it because it's describing how US President succeeded in convincing the US Senate to agree upon the partial nuclear test ban of treaty discussed with the chairman of the USSR Communist Party just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. In some way, this book is a bright demonstration on how being successful when facing a strong opposition to your initial plans. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to welcome Professor Jeff Sax, whose lecture title is The Earth Sciences in the Age of Sustainable Development.
Dennis, thank you very much, and to all of the members of the AGU here, thank you for the chance to be with you today with this unique and crucial union of the earth sciences, geophysics, and the knowledge that we're going to need for planetary safety in the 21st century. It's a great thrill, and for me, an extraordinarily wonderful and unique opportunity to share some ideas about global diplomacy, the global economy, and the stakes of the planet that we all share, and the unique role of you, the scientific community, in geophysics and other earth sciences, in the crucial role that you have, the unique role, because you're the only ones that can give the information that we need to steer in the 21st century in a way to safety. I'm going to try to describe to you my view of this from an economist's vision and from a diplomatic point of view, the UN diplomacy, which is extraordinarily active right now. I'm just returned from the Peru COP20, and I think that it gives us some insights into the path to Paris COP21, which is our last and therefore absolutely essential and vital chance to keep climate safety on the planet. It's slipping beyond our reach, but we have one more chance of it. And again, I think AGU has an enormous potential to play in finding that one opportunity. This map that you see in the world is, I find, a useful graphic, just emphasizing how we are now a completely interconnected planet. The white lines are the airline routes, the blue lines are the major shipping lanes, the white dots are the main cities of the world. The green is a representation of the road networks in the world. A mathematician would call this a complete graph. There's connection from every point to every other point in the world. It is the unique phenomenon of our time, this tremendous interpenetration of flows of every kind, whether it's economic, financial, technological, people, plague like Ebola spreading, and others. And it is our vital need to learn to live effectively in this crowded, completely interconnected world. We are led to the concept, of course, of the Anthropocene, the concept that Paul Crutzen dramatized and popularized for us, the fact that we are in a new epoch in Earth's history. And I find it impressive that more and more evidence says that the Anthropocene is not only a wonderful metaphor, but a literal fact of geology as well, in measurement of the same kinds of epoch dating that give us the earlier epochs of the planet. Why are we in this Earth-driven process? Essentially because of scale, because of the scale of human activity, and because of the unprecedented breakthroughs that occurred in the human scale within the last 2 centuries. A transformation of global society so fundamental and dramatic that our institutions and our psychology, and of course our politics, even our values, are unable to keep up with this reality. This is the most important single driver of that scale change. One can debate, as economists and historians and others have, the onset of the modern economic age, and we have libraries to fill it. But I think it's fair to say that the most fundamental breakthrough of all was the ability to harness massive amounts of energy for motive power, made possible by James Watt's discovery of the principle of separating a condenser from the cylinder of the Newcomen steam engine. And it was with that modern, economical, efficient steam engine that the entire world changed. Suddenly, the massive amount of energy at hand, dug up first as coal, later as oil, now as hydrofracked natural gas, has transformed the world economy, transformed society, and brought us to our present state of affairs. All relevant economic history graphs look like this. All of them. This is a reconstruction by a wonderful, now late, macro historian named Angus Maddison, who calculated the gross output by region and then added it up for the world, basically from the time of Christ onward, from 1 AD till now. Now, there were not agencies for national income accounts in 1 AD. Indeed, they didn't even exist till after post-World War II. But it's not so hard or far-fetched to create a graph of world output, a little bit the way you might create a graph of world temperatures or CO2 concentrations. There are plenty of pieces of evidence, but the most important bit of evidence for the world is that the vast majority of humanity, for the vast majority of history until the 19th century, lived as farmers in rural areas at the edge of subsistence. And one can measure the kinds of crops that they grew, that they raised, and their yields. And since that was the bulk of the economy anywhere and basically everywhere up until recently, a reconstruction of this sort is absolutely plausible. Basically, not much changed for almost 2,000 years. And the most famous political economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, in one of his most famous essays, in fact, noted in this 1930 essay that had a Roman peasant farmer been brought to England in 1750, he would have felt quite at home with the technologies and with the overall material conditions. Because while there were slow changes, they were not enough to make that graph move. But suddenly the graph shoots due north, and roughly on the measured marketed output of the world, we've had 2 orders of magnitude increase from the start of what we call the Industrial Revolution, which I've already asserted essentially began with the breakout from the so-called organic economy to the fossil fuel era, made possible by harnessing coal for motive force. And that is the almost nearly vertical line. If you look at output per person, it's almost the same. And we have a basically 1 order magnitude average world increase of output per person over the last 2 centuries. Now, it's not easy and all that meaningful to compare the living standards or output per person on a consistent basis when it's a world of new types of products and activities. But the simplest representations using national accounts methodology suggest a 1 order magnitude increase of output per person. Population looks just the same. The world population was in the hundreds of millions essentially from the start of the Common Era, 1 AD, until around 1700, and then began a rhythm ascent that was noted by Malthus in 1798, that there was a more secular tendency for the population to increase, but it was basically with the same revolution of mobilizing energy, but not only for the motive force of factories, but the transport of foodstuffs, and then later for the deployment of atmospheric nitrogen into urea-based fertilizer with the Haber-Bosch process, that the world population could soar, and we went from about 500 million people over a long period of nearly 2 millennia to reaching 1 billion, estimated to be around 1820, 2 billion estimated to be reached around 1920, and now we are 7.3 billion people and rising. So we've also had roughly a 1 order magnitude increase of population since Malthus first warned us about population increases following productivity increases. We've had roughly a 9-time rise of population from 1798, when the population was about 800 or so million people. Well, that's all dramatic, but we know that there's a side effect, and the graph looks pretty much the same on the same time scale. We have a dramatic, unprecedented rise, for example, of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. If I extended this back 800 million years, it would look the same, but with a few sawtooths through the glacial and interglacial periods. But basically, the breakout to the modern era of output per person, energy use per person, aggregate economic activity, population, is, of course, also reflected in the human impact on the physical environment. And that's the great drama. We have filled the planet with population. We have filled the planet with economic activity per person. We have a 100-fold plus increase of human impact. And, of course, the planetary scale has remained precisely unchanged during those 2 centuries in terms of underlying ecosystems and capacity of ecosystems to dissipate human activity, and therein lies the crucial challenge. Of course, the Industrial Revolution that started with James Watt has not ended with James Watt. We have had what are called long technology waves since then. They generally are numbered roughly 5 long technology waves. We now call this endogenous economic growth. It used to be called Kondratiev long technology waves. But the idea is that clusters of critical technologies, starting with steam, and then, of course, rail and steel making, which can't come together as a package, electrification and modern chemistry, automobiles, aviation, and now the 5th such wave of the digital revolution and information and communications technologies, have been propelled forward by a global capitalist integrated world system. And that is a dramatically successful world system in the sense of increasing economic output, and also in the sense of raising average living standards. But it is not a successful economic system in the sense of ensuring either economic fairness, the ability to draw limits, or the ability to respect fundamental biological and planetary boundaries. Our own current revolution, of course, is the information revolution. All these graphs look the same. You just have to change the scale and the title. This one is Moore's Law. It is the observation that Gordon Moore made in 1965 that for the preceding 7 years since Jack Kilby had put a transistor on a silicon chip, the transistor count was doubling roughly every 18 months up till 1965. Now the spacing has been more like 24 months, but we've had approximately 29 doublings since Kilby and Noyce first made this breakthrough, and we are now at 5 billion chips on the latest Intel microprocessor. This is, for us, the most fundamental driver of planetary change in our time. I think it is on par, by the way, with the other fundamental breakthroughs. What the digital revolution means for the economy, for every area of science that we're engaged in, for every area of economic production is profound, transformative, and potentially hugely positive. But like every technology, it always has two sides to it, and the proper use of technology is a choice, not an inevitability. Another graph of the same shape shows that information revolution has made possible the fastest diffusion of any single human technology in history, because we are living in an age of acceleration by objective terms. Our fastest economies grow faster. Our most powerful technologies diffuse faster than ever before in history. And I would say that the most dramatic technological success of our age, building on ICT, is mobile communications, which went from an estimated 23,000 subscribers in 1980 to 7 billion subscribers today. It's truly a feat that is almost unimaginable, and in this case, by the way, mainly market-driven, which is all the more remarkable. This is not something that government made possible other than the more fundamental technologies, but the diffusion of this technology has been basically on a market basis, even reaching, in this case, to the very poorest of the poor communities around the world, because it's such a superlative technology for staying alive and for meeting a huge range of human needs, from business to personal needs. What it means is that the rate of change that we experience is phenomenal. This is a picture of Shenzhen, China. Some of you may have been there. It's the outskirts of Hong Kong. This is literally a picture looking over the valley of Shenzhen in 1980. And I will show you what that same vantage point looks like today. It went from not bad, huh? Really unbelievable. It went from 20,000 farmers to 20 million urban inhabitants in the period since 1980. That's also a kind of Moore's Law. That's what China's growth has been. It averaged 10% per year growth from 1978 until about 2 years ago. And that kind of growth means a doubling period of 7 years. And so over 35 years, we have had 5 doublings, which is a 32-fold increase of Chinese output. And that's what it looks like in real terms. Absolutely astounding. Now, if I summarize the kind of world that we have therefore created, viewed from an economics and technological and geopolitical optic, I would say the following. First, we are operating with global scale production systems. The dominant force of the world economy is multinational production and multinational system standards as well. Of course, there are individual enterprises, there's a lot of small firms and so on, but the dominant fact of the world economy is large, multinational, global scale systems makers. Second, that world economy has been enabled and enables ICT technological upheaval. In fact, the whole world economy that is based on this global ownership and production system could not function without the underlying IT of communications, transport, logistics, design, processing, and so forth that has made possible that integrated global system. We have a very complicated set of demographic changes underway. There is very rapid population growth continuing in Africa. I'll show you that in a moment. at the same time that we have population stabilization and aging in a lot of the rest of the world. But the net growth of world population continues to be rapid. Don't think it stopped. It remains about net 75 to 80 million people added to the world population per year. We reached 7 billion people by the UN population clock on Halloween Day 2011, and the projection is that we'll reach 8 billion people by 2024 and 9 billion people by 2040. So there's a continued rapid expansion of that vertical population line. Of course, all of them also want a rising output per capita, and the world economy as a whole continues to grow at between 3% and 4% per year. And that means a doubling time of roughly every generation, roughly 20 years. The aggregate output of the world economy is continuing to double. We have a kind of complex jobs crisis because of rapid technological change. And of course, point number 5, which will be the core of the remainder of my lecture, we have an extreme environmental crisis that has come from this scale change. And the crisis is imminent, dramatic, and hugely pressed by the continuing dynamic of the world economy. And we have to somehow handle this in the context of the 6th point, a tremendously complicated global geopolitics. 25 years ago, we talked about a world of bipolar powers, the US and the Soviet Union. One of them disappeared. There was a brief moment when people talked about a unipolar world. That was a myth, because just as we were talking about it, the multipolar world was actually forming. Of course, the rise of China is the single most significant geopolitical and economic event in modern history. But what is also true is the complexity of global management of all of these processes is phenomenally large, because the United States does not lead and does not choose to lead anymore, but the systems of cooperative leadership are yet to be made. And I didn't see it, but I was told this morning that our Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, a great friend of the earth sciences, apparently made some statement to the effect to the rest of the world, don't trust our government on its commitments, we're the Senate, we'll decide. This means that we have multipolarity in the US government of an extreme sort also. This is an enormously complicated political moment at a time of unprecedented human challenge. Good news is that economic progress is real, whereas 90+% of the world always lived at the edge of survival and poverty in the past. It's fair to say that the proportion of the world in extreme poverty is now down to perhaps 15% of the world's population, roughly 1 in 6. This is a huge triumph of the world economic dynamism. It's real. It's not a fiction of the data. On the other hand, we have 3 profound challenges that take away any feeling of complacency. One is that our world has become a world of profound inequalities at the same time as a world of reduced extreme poverty. And I should add that even if you're 1 in 6 of the world population, you're still talking about 1.2 billion people on the planet in the 21st century who struggle literally every day to stay alive. 1 mosquito bite away from death, 1 heat spell or drought away from death. And so the challenge of extreme poverty is real, even if the percentages have come down. The inequalities more generally are profound and in many ways growing. We have continued rapid population growth even though the proportionate rate of growth has fallen by half relative to the peak in early 70s, which was about 2.1% per year population growth, down to about 1.1% today, down by half. The base has doubled, so the absolute numbers of people still are rising by roughly the same 75 to 80 million, as has been true now for quite a while. And we have the environmental crises. Just briefly, this is a graph of U.S. inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. It shows the dramatic increase of inequality in U.S. society over the past 4 decades. It's an inequality driven in many ways by globalization and by technological change, and then amplified by the positive feedbacks of politics in which money speaks loud in our country and ever louder. And so the rich do get richer, both by fundamental drivers and then by an added political weight that they're able to bring to bear. This is the Gini coefficient in China during this boom period. Rising living standards, rising inequality as well. This is the scene on cities around the world. There are young people out on the streets everywhere. I can no longer fit all of the pictures that one would want to show, but the unrest is palpable around the world these days because of the inequalities and the lack of social cohesion and social trust. This is a graph of the 4 scenario variants of the UN population forecast for Africa. I won't go into it at depth except to tell you the shocking baseline number shown by the green line here. In 1950, in the middle of the last century, the estimated population for sub-Saharan Africa was 179 million people. 179. Today, because of high fertility rates and reductions of child mortality rates, the population has reached 1 billion people. So more than a 5-fold increase. The medium fertility forecast of the UN Population Division has Africa reaching 4 billion people by the end of this century, another 2 doublings during the 21st century. I don't believe that's really feasible, certainly not in a context of sustainable development. But it shows the drama of population and scale that still is pressing on the story of finding a path that is suitable for human well-being and for planetary stability. Now, I said that the Anthropocene was all about scale, about the 2 orders of magnitude increase of human impacts minimum. It's much greater magnitude if we look at specific kinds of impacts. And I think the best summary description of those impacts is the concept of planetary boundaries that was put forward by a group of ecologists in Nature magazine in 2009. Of course, there are many challenges to this concept at a technical level, but I believe that it is a very powerful and effective summary to say that we have potential tipping points across many dimensions of the ecosystems, and that we're reaching many of those danger thresholds now, or we've already exceeded them. At 12 o'clock noon on this famous picture is climate change, which is by far the most dangerous human driver for the 21st century. If I go around the clock from 12 noon and go forward, ocean acidification from the dissolving of CO2 in the ocean surface level, stratospheric ozone depletion, nitrogen and phosphorus flux, global freshwater depletion from dams and groundwater depletion and glacier disappearance, changes in land use destroying massive amounts of habitat, biodiversity loss, atmospheric aerosol loadings, and then a whole range of chemical pollutants. All of these are basic scale-driven phenomena. we are just pressing against every part of the ecosystems and biodiversity in multiple ways now because of the scale of economic activity. The amount of fossil fuel use, the amount of land use clearing for food supplies, the amount of forest clearing for pasture land as meat per capita consumption continues to rise, the nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes that are secondary to the massive amounts of chemical fertilizers that are now put on about 150 million metric tons per year in order to feed the planet, which we do not feed at all decently today, but which is pressing hard. And then the poisoning of the air, especially over the megacities of Asia, because of the brown aerosols, the carbon loading of various kinds, the continued heavy coal use, and so forth. For me, traveling for the United Nations this year, it's been a kind of tour of ecological disaster. I'll just show you pictures from my visits this year, not in situ visits, but places where I came and then clipped a picture from the newspapers in real time. Drought, heavy drought in Brazil, in Sao Paulo state early in the year. Massive drought and forest fires in Sumatra when I visited Indonesia a couple of months later. Unprecedented 1 in 500 year or 1 in millennium floods in the Balkans when I was in Serbia in June. Massive flooding in Hiroshima region in Japan when I visited Japan in August. And now I'm happy to be in California. I know your drought broke a little bit a few days ago, but the intensity of the California drought is, of course, severe and most likely a signal of deeper, longer-term secular changes as well. Drought is reaching much of the planet this year, large parts of Africa, large parts of the Middle East, large parts of the Mediterranean basin, large parts of the Amazon and Sao Paulo region, the U.S. West Coast, large parts of Australia. It's been a year of mega drought as well as mega flooding. And of course, it will be almost surely at this point the hottest year in instrument record when instrumentation confirms for December of this year. But it looks almost surely to be on track. April, May, June, August, September, and October have all been the warmest months of their category since instrument records of 1881. So, what to do about this? Oh my God. That's our problem. We really are the generation that reached the limits. We were warned about the limits 2 generations ago in 1972. It was actually the first book I was ever assigned as a freshman Harvard economics student in fall 1972, Limits to Growth, except the reason it was assigned was that my economics teacher told me not to believe it. It's been said again and again in history, it's always wrong, this model doesn't have prices in it. That's what I was told. Took me a long time to overcome my education, but I very much believe it now. We are the ones that are going to grapple with this. We're 1 generation after the Earth Summit, after 3 treaties were signed on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. Not one of them has yet proved to be operational. In 2012, on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, the world's governments convened in Rio again and put sustainable development as the central theme of the coming period for the world community. They define sustainable development in a helpful way, in my view, in a pragmatic, operational definition, meaning that sustainable development is an integrated strategy to meet economic, social, and environmental objectives. I use the term sustainable development in 2 senses. One, as an analytical complex systems science, that sustainable development is the science of complex interacting social, economic, environmental, and political systems. That's from an analytical point of view. From a moral or normative point of view, I say that sustainable development is an integrated framework which tells us to stop an economics-only approach to public policy and to address three spheres of human well-being: economic, social, and environmental, in a holistic manner. The good news is, as fragile as it is, the world has bought into that concept of sustainable development, and indeed has put it as a centerpiece for the coming period that will be defined as an era from 2015 to 2030 in a very specific way. Next year, in September 2015, there will be the world's largest gathering in history of heads of state and government. Probably about 170 or 180 heads of state and government will come to the United Nations on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations and will adopt Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as a framework of action for the coming generation. It is an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity to help redirect the world juggernaut economy. Indeed, there are three core negotiations that will take place next year. In July next year in Addis Ababa, there will be a summit on financing for sustainable development, how to make the world financial system do more than promote bubbles, but actually finance the transformation to sustainable development. Then will be the adoption at UN headquarters of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then in December 2015 will be the adoption of the Last Chance Climate Agreement at COP21 in Paris. The last chance we have to stay below the 2 degrees C upper limit of warming that governments have agreed to for the last 6 years but have not yet begun to operationalize. There will be many SDG priorities. I don't have time to go through them, but they range from poverty and social inclusion to controlling climate change and preserving biodiversity. They are still to be negotiated. They will be negotiated and adopted next September. They can be critical for helping the next generation of young people to have in a coherent way the idea of a holistic approach to human well-being that puts economic, social, and environmental considerations into an equal par and an integrated framework. Of course, to achieve sustainable development in a world of 8 or 9 billion people requires deep transformation of these global systems. We need to move from a high carbon to a low carbon energy system within 2 generations. We've never done anything like this on a cooperative basis. But we need to direct technological change on a massive global scale in order to decarbonize the world economy. We need to make the agricultural system, which is the #1 anthropogenic driver of earth change, of land use, of biodiversity threat, even of greenhouse gas emissions, into sustainable, nutritious agriculture. It's a huge scientific, technological, and social transformation needed. And of course, we need to make cities livable, because cities will be home to 70 or 80% of the world's population and even a much larger proportion of the world's output by the middle of this century. For that, we need new systems design based on sustainable technologies. To get there, we need new ways of cooperating. And as a shorthand, I call them the global public-private partnerships for sustainable technologies. We need to bridge the academic, the business, the national laboratory worlds in order to improve the performance of sustainable technologies, and then help them to not only be demonstrated, but to diffuse as rapidly as the mobile phones. This is a huge undertaking, but it's part of the basic arithmetic of planetary sustainable development. We have no time to lose. The carbon budget alone demands it. Fortunately, so much of the modern era has actually been directed technological change. Sometimes my colleagues in economics think that technology evolves by market forces. This is to some extent true, but it's vastly exaggerated. A huge amount of basic technology evolves through direction. Alas, mainly through direction by the military, by the way, because that's who invests in public goods, or whatever you call them, in non-market goods. But a large part of our modern world was born in military appropriations. That's how the first computers were sold. John von Neumann's first computers were to model thermonuclear blasts. The first semiconductors were for the radar. The first integrated circuits were for NASA in the 1960s, and so forth. We have an incredibly powerful model of public-private partnerships for advancing technology, but we have to direct it not just at military applications, but at survival. And that really is a huge part of our challenge. I made a list of all the fundamental breakthroughs from vaccines, radar, cryptography, nuclear energy, computing, semiconductors, satellites, internet, the Human Genome Project, discovering the Higgs boson, and the New Brain Initiative that are all examples of these public-private partnerships. They really work. This is the 100,000-fold reduction of cost of the human genome sequencing from 2001 to this year through a targeted effort of the National Institutes of Health, which got together the genome sequencers in 2001 after the Human Genome Project and said, what next? And they said, let's go from $100 million per sequence down to $1,000 per sequence by 2015. And they beat the target by 1 year. And they beat Moore's Law dramatically, because Moore's Law on this semi-log scale is the straight white line, and the human genome cost reduction dramatically outpaces Moore's Law. We have to do that for photovoltaics. We have to do that for clean energy. We have to do that for sustainable crops, and so on. From the point of view of climate, and I'm going to try to reach an end just in the next couple of minutes, the business as usual emissions scenario is the top line. That would take us to a 4 to 6 degree warming world by the end of the century. The line we need to be on CO2 emissions is the bottom blue line, which reaches net zero by 2070. That's the reference concentration pathway 2.6 of the IPCC. We need to bend the curve dramatically to low carbon electrification. Two of my colleagues in this, Jim Williams and Margaret Torner, here showing in the most practical kind of modeling how this is feasible with technologies either at hand or those that are within reach. But we need to do it. We need roadmaps, guideposts, milestones, like the Human Genome Project, but then to put it into effect, like California State has decided to do, and like President Obama reiterated in the U.S.-China agreement a couple of weeks ago that said the U.S. goal is an 80% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2050, but we need to get there. We can do it because all these good curves can look the same. This is the cumulative capacity of photovoltaic cells. And the improvements are now a 100-time improvement of cost reductions, the so-called Swanson's law for PV. But we can do even better than that, because with new organic PV and other advances, and I'm sure there are people here that are the progenitors of those advances, there are huge breakthroughs possible that can carry us in the same direction to a low and then zero carbon technology. what is the role of the scientific community in all of this? I think there are 5 fundamental, unique roles for the AGU and for you individually. The first, of course, is understanding mechanisms. Without understanding climate science, without understanding ozone depletion, without understanding the deep science, we don't stand a chance. So obviously we need the scientific enterprise in its most fundamental sense. Without it, we're lost. We have nothing. And we don't even know what we're doing on the planet, just as we didn't know until Molina and Crutzen and Sherry Rowland came along and told us about ozone depletion. We had no idea we were doing that. So we need the basic mechanisms. Second, we need fundamental monitoring and mapping of Earth systems states. We need detailed observation, but with a dynamic point of view. How is Earth changing? Believe me, the diplomats and the social scientists and the politicians don't know how to do that. You're the only ones in the world that know how to map Earth states in ways that we need to understand. We need all the Keelings of the world going up to the top of Mauna Loa and doing all the equivalents in every other way of nitrogen and phosphorus fluxes, of biodiversity measurement, of measurement of carbon fluxes from the canopies of rainforests and all the rest to have a chance to know where we are in this world and how it's changing. So monitoring and mapping I would put as second. Third, we need to develop much better than we do the interface of the earth sciences and the human policy sciences. We need integrated modeling, GIS-based spatial temporal models that integrate economic systems and physical earth systems. We don't have that yet. Economists for a long time thought that countries are organized in the world in alphabetical order. They look at lists. They don't look at maps, places, space, but they're beginning to, thanks to ArcGIS, thanks to other data coming. But we need to build those spatial temporal models together. Fourth, we need to engage in directed technological change. And this is a huge role of the scientific and engineering communities. This is not just markets doing clever things. This is saying we need to move to a low-carbon economy. We need to move to water-efficient crops. We need to move to nitrogen and phosphorus-efficient crops and the like. That's directed technological change. And by the way, the business community, no matter if they invest, can't do it. We cannot understand carbon capture and sequestration, not a prayer, without the geology community. You might have energy system engineers doing the above-ground carbon capture, but only the geologists can tell us if the CO2 is going in the ground, if it's staying in the ground, how it's entering saline aquifers or pore spaces, whether it's staying underground, whether it's migrating, whether it's safe, whether it's leaking. And the business community does not know that, by the way, because they haven't made the interface with AGU in the way that's absolutely essential to test the feasibility of large scale of that technology. And finally, we need public education. And this is our role also. Most of us are educators in one way or another. We need to be educators 3 times over. First, in our classrooms. Second, now through our MOOCs and our online education, which can reach people hungry for education all over the world. And third, in our public education. I know that Senator Imhoff wants a course in climate science, and we need to give it to him and to the other 99 senators as well. The planet is far too precious. Our children are far too precious to leave it to games. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for all the wonderful work you do.
Thank you very much. So, thank you, Jeff. So we would like to open the floor for very short questions because we have a very limited time and we have mics on the alley. So please, you go to the mics because of the way.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
If I may, is the mic on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It seems that a basic question beyond the technological issues that you mentioned is how you define a basic standard of living for a global population. Could you comment on that?
Yes. I think the only basic answer to that question is the concept of convergence, that the system must remain open so that there are not permanent castes of rich and poor defined in the world, but there's a common destination of humanity, that the door is not closed to development, but that the rich countries also not say to the poor countries, you're not allowed to do X, but we'll do X. So when it comes to carbon, for example, we need a common destination that by mid-century we're all emitting roughly the same amount per capita. For the US, that might mean a 90% reduction of CO2 per person, whereas for a poor country today it may mean staying at the same level, roughly 1.5 tons per person, and then we all have to reach a common destination of net zero by perhaps 2070 or 2080. So the only concept that will sell, because there's a fundamental driver, which is that the poor countries say, not just because we're later, we don't stay here, is we're all in this together, and every agreement must be symmetrical from an ethical point of view. That actually is what occupies most of the time of global negotiations. But for me, the most fundamental point is that we're aiming to converge to the same place without creating permanent boundaries of rich and poor.
Kevin Trenboth from NCAR. You spoke about many needs and there's sort of an implicit assumption that somehow we will meet those needs, although you didn't mention the need to get rid of most of the politicians in Washington.
Right.
And how we do that. And so that's one of the problems. We can't get rid of those people. And so how do we actually meet these needs? And so I want to ask you what you think is the likeliest pressure point or failure point that we're apt to face. I mean, for me, one of them is water. We're not making more water. We're redistributing it with climate change and so on. But I wonder if you can comment on the other side of your...
Yeah. Basically, when you do an analysis of what it would mean to decarbonize energy and to shift to sustainable agriculture and to stabilize the world's population, not at 10 or 11 billion, but at 8.5 billion, and then numbers gradually falling after mid-century. All of this is feasible within the reach of good economics, technology, and so on. What is not in place is the politics, the understanding, the cooperation, the coordination, the systems design, and all of the zero-sum struggles that may entail. But my view is that, broadly speaking, we can have a much better world for all by mid-century in which living standards are higher and sustainability is achieved, but it's a profound problem of inertia, because this economic system is a juggernaut. It's based on an existing set of technologies that resist change for many systems reasons, not only vested interests, but put vested interests high on the list. I have to tell you, worldwide, there's a lot of attention and worry to these realities now. So I speak in the General Assembly all the time to maybe representatives of 100 or 120 governments at a time. Nobody stands up and says, that's not true. We don't have that problem. There's general anxiety. That's not a bad starting point. Then there is the U.S. Congress. It's very particular, the U.S. Congress. David Koch owns it. and this is a big problem, actually, which is that our own politics have become hugely corrupt, though with the genius of the Supreme Court, all legally corrupt. But it's also not the universal politics, I have to tell you. The universal politics is a lot of worry and what can we do? How can we move? I would not take the current state of U.S. politics as the end or inevitable state. This is the state of a game of how much money can be poured anonymously into how many races to defend coal, oil, and gas. But it's not a true equilibrium politically, and it does not represent the views of the American people, by the way, which are shown repeatedly in surveys to be worried and not to be happy with the status quo energy system, to want to move to renewables and so on. I don't have a simple answer. We all watch the politics here, but I don't believe it's impossible. We've had major systems change. It's several episodes. I would mention the Progressive Era, the New Deal in the 1960s, and I believe we're long overdue for another one now, and I think it's worth fighting for.
So we have to prep. Okay. I'm sorry we can't take any more questions. Thank you again, Jeff.